Hello and welcome to What's the Story, the book show that will hopefully reignite your burning desire to cozy up with a good book. Now, he says he once won a limbo competition and a crisp taste test competition in the same venue in the same half hour. An incredible claim to fame from our author, Dave Rudden. But Dave, the burning question, Tato or King?
Has to be King, I'm afraid. Sorry to all the Tato fans out there.
Oh, I don't know about that now. Also joining me, it is writer Nadine O'Regan. I have to ask Nadine, have you ever won a limbo competition?
Have I ever won a limbo competition? No, I have not. The only competition I can think of that I won that was a little bit exceptional was when a bumblebee stung me on the knee while I was taking part in a feshciol. I fell over, I was age 5, and I got a medal for participation. So there you go. Best I can do.
What was the first ever book that had a proper impact on you?
There are so many books by so many children's books authors that were huge. Roald Dahl, Enid Blyton, so many. But probably the first more adult book that I absolutely loved was Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. A book that I felt so immersed in, and it just gave me a sense that there was another world, a world that once you opened its covers, you were enveloped within. And from that point forward, I was hooked on reading.
It's an absolute classic and such a beautiful series as well, and all the books on Jane Eyre and everything. Dave, what about yourself? Any book that jumps to mind had the first impact on you that's really impactful on your everyday life?
So I was lucky/unlucky in that my parents weren't big readers, and so they would just give me anything that they thought might suit me. So anything with like blood or murder or death on the cover, they're like, "Oh, Dave will like that. He's 9, but look, it's time he learned." So they gave me Dracula when I was 8. Did not understand most of it, but I was like, "There's a lot of violence happening here," and then I was kind of hooked on becoming a horror writer after that.
Sure, look, it didn't do you any harm.
Yeah. Years of therapy may differ, but sure, yeah.
Now, on to today's first book, Declan O'Rourke's literary debut, the story of the O'Buchala family as they face their most perilous winter, and woven into a powerful account of the famine's grip on one Irish town. This meticulously researched, multi-layered work tells the story of Macroom's residents of all class and creed, including the local pawnbroker, Cornelius Creed. It's the pawnbroker's reward. Now, Nadine, you'll have to tell us all about this book. I know you were reading it for us.
Yes, all I can say is thank God it's good, because it's over 450 pages. So when it arrived, there was that sort of trepidation that you have when you go, oh goodness, because it's a debut novel from Declan O'Rourke, very well known, of course, for his work as a singer-songwriter. Galileo is such a classic song. And this book was inspired actually by an album he released in 2017, which was a song saga centering on famine times. He had done some research, read 20 books plus on the famine, partly because his own grandfather actually had been born in a workhouse, and he had found that out and decided to investigate further. This book is the consequence of that. It's beautifully written, very painterly, very vivid. And of course, the subject matter is harrowing. It's Macroom in the 1840s. It's the story of Pádraig and Cauldron, their 2 children who are just trying to survive. And it's also the story of Cornelius Creed, the pawnbroker, who worries that even as he's trying to help the poor, he's also potentially taking advantage of them.
Sounds like an incredible story, and I guess growing up we've all heard so much about the famine from our grandparents, and I think it's really important to keep these stories alive as well.
Yeah, I mean, I was born and raised in Skibbereen, and just down the road from our house there's a graveyard with a space in it which is just dedicated to the people whose bodies were thrown in there in that time. And every time I would pass that graveyard, I would think about it. Skibbereen was one of the hardest hit towns during the famine. So for me, reading this book had huge resonance because Declan O'Rourke has done phenomenal research. So everything that he's writing about, yes, this is fiction, but it's based on real life stories, real people who were there in the 1840s and who lost their lives. So for me, it was a very powerful work.
And I suppose for him as well, going over from music to author, like how did you find that change?
I was actually really, really pleasantly surprised. And it's not to say, of course, I'd always rate his songwriting, but often you can see somebody who's good in one art form, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they will continue on to be good in another. But he proves himself so capable here. The sentences really sing. It is a long book, and there are times when you feel like, okay, you can sense he's struggling a little bit towards towards the end to wrap up everything up in a neat bow. But he's also a debut author, so that's only to be expected. I thought it was just such a promising debut, it's such a great harbinger for the future, what he might produce.
I know it'll be interesting to see, will he stay going down the kind of historical route, or will he go into something more, more novel-like in time to come?
Yeah, well, in terms of who I'd compare him to, I think you could think of people like, say, Sebastian Barry, who also actually work in the area of historical fiction. And I could see him going forward and telling more stories that are rooted in fact, but that he weaves a fiction around them. I think he's started a whole great new career for himself.
And as we said, we all know about the famine growing up. So while you're reading the book, did you feel like he was able to bring you back into that moment?
Yeah, and it's in the small details. He has a way of describing people's faces, of the smells in the streets, of what it feels like to be in the poorhouse, or how other people are looking on as someone gets the small meagre ration of a griddle cake and the hunger is etched on their face. At a certain point, Pádraig goes working the roads in order to sustain his family. So he's doing back-breaking labour, walking, 7 miles plus a day for the meagre sum of 6p a day. And all these tiny details root you in that reality. It's really beautifully achieved.
Well, I think it's incredible for him as well. Of course, Declan O'Rourke's debut book, and really looking forward to reading that one as well. Nadine O'Regan, thank you so much for that. And whether that's the book for you or not, there are, of course, tons of other titles you should be looking out for in your local bookshop, as author Sinead Moriarty has been finding out.
These are the top picks by Eason of sports biographies. Absolutely cracking selection here. First up, we have Champagne Football by Mark Tighe and Paul Rowan, who are two investigative journalists who looked in to the little fiefdom that John Delaney had created for himself at the FAI. And we realised that John was spending more money on champagne than football, thus the title. Next up, we have Sean O'Brien, Fuel. So Sean grew up on a farm in Tullow, and he wasn't a very likely rugby player, but he went on to be incredibly successful and talented and represent his country many, many times. Now we have Tiger, the famous Tiger who needs no second name. This book shows us the lengths he went to become successful, the determination, the dedication, and all the help he got behind the scenes. Next we have The Secret Race by Tyler Hamilton. This is an absolutely fascinating insight into the world of cycling. Tyler Hamilton was a teammate of Lance Armstrong, and he blows the whole drugs thing wide open. We find out how they got the drugs, how they took the drugs, and how much drugs they took. Next up we have When the World Stops Watching by Damien Lawler. In this book he explores the lives of 16 athletes and what happens to them when the world stops watching and their sporting careers are over. Now we have Rob Kearney's No Hiding. Rob Kearney is one of the most decorated rugby players who played for Ireland, and this is a tell-all inside the dressing room account of life as a rugby player. I absolutely loved this book. So it's opened by Andre Agassi, very famous tennis player, and it's really interesting because he talks about how much he hates tennis. He has a very conflicting relationship with tennis. Sometimes he loves it, sometimes he hates it. It's about all of that, and it's about how he ended up marrying Steffi Graf. And now Maradona, the greatest footballer in the world, some would say. This book talks about what an amazing footballer he was, but also, unfortunately, how controversial he was as a man. Next up, we have Pat Nevin, the accidental footballer. One of Chelsea's greatest players, Pat gives us some great insight into the dressing room, the crack, the shenanigans, and what really went on. And last, but definitely not least, we have Cora Staunton. This is an incredible story of an incredible woman. She talks about her career, and she also talks very honestly about the struggles she encountered along the way. And there you have it, the top picks by Eason of sports biographies.
Now on to Dave. Dave, I have to ask about guilty pleasures. Now, literary guilty pleasures, that's what I'm talking about.
So I love trashy sci-fi, like the trash, those like pulp novels you get like 3 for €1. That is like totally my jam. I'll devour like 10 of them across a weekend. But in my defense, I did find out recently that Henry Cavill of The Witcher is also a huge fan of the same series, the Warhammer books. So like clearly he's one of us, so I don't feel as bad.
I think you'll have to go into a few charity shops and pick up a few books there, Dave. I think there's the few that you'd probably get some guilty pleasures from. Nadine, what about yourself? Any guilty pleasures?
There are no guilty pleasures. In reading, there are no guilty pleasures. There's just beautiful books. If I'm reading the back of the cornflake packet, and you're reading, that's the point. Just get everybody reading. That said, if I'm really tired, I love good crime fiction or a good rock memoir. So in crime fiction, actually, Catherine Ryan-Harrod's recent book, 56 Days, is absolutely brilliant. You won't be able to put it down. Another book I love in the kind of rock memoir is Anthony Kiedis's of the Red Hot Chili Peppers Scar Tissue. Absolutely love that book. And actually, the Bruce Springsteen autobiography is brilliant as well. So no guilty pleasures, just pleasurable reading. And yeah, those would be a few of my picks.
Oh, unreal. Well, I found a Jilly Cooper book there at home recently, so I'm going to get stuck into that. But time for our next book, Washington correspondent Brian O'Donovan's lively and authoritative reporting of a tumultuous period in American life has been must-watch TV, covering the extraordinary presidency of Donald Trump and the knife-edge election of Joe Biden. His unique perspective on big stories such as the white supremacist protests in Charlottesville, the COVID emergency, the Capitol riot, and the murder of George Floyd and trial of his police killer. A visceral sense of what it's like living in a country shaped by guns, God, far-fetched conspiracy theories, and the running sore of racism. Sounds absolutely fascinating. The book is 4 Years in the Cauldron by Brian O'Donovan. First off, Dave, I have to ask, did you read it in his voice?
Oh, 100%. Like I think everybody in the country, I was glued to the TV during the Trump presidency and, of course, all through COVID. And it got to the point where myself and my wife had sort of a platonic crush on his very calming voice. We would tune in every week. And that's essentially what this book is. Yeah. Like, you can almost hear that sort of RTE intonation. You know, it was freezing in Iowa, but a different kind of storm was brewing in the capital, like that kind of thing. I hope there's an audiobook. I hope he does the audiobook. I did really enjoy it. I mean, the blurb describes it as 4 busy years working in the US, which must be like the understatement of the century. There's so much happened that you can almost, even a year on, you kind of forget the daily, ridiculous, kind of horrible theatre of it. And this is sort of a lateral slice of all the different stories that he covered. I think going in, I was sort of expecting a kind of a deep dive into Trump and his psychology, and obviously there are a lot of books like that, but this is definitely more what it was like to be essentially the correspondent for an entire continent. I mean, he wasn't just the Washington correspondent, he was traveling all across the country, picking up on obviously the George Floyd murder, Conor McGregor's arrests, the Capitol riots, and obviously the advent of the Biden presidency, and a lot of like human interest stories as well. But I think what kind of tied it together for me is a sort of human interest story of Brian sort of like essentially like going through all these different places, rushing around, trying to cover everything. There's all these quite cute little stories of like him having a going away party for his camera woman, and they realized they would never have a moment where they would find time to do it. So just had like cans on a train going back to the office, or like hopefully I'm not getting him in trouble by saying that. Or like a huge story breaking when he was on a holiday with his kids. So he had to throw on a suit jacket and shirt and do the news in his shorts with the camera angled so you couldn't see. All this kind of stuff like really humanized his sort of experience. So I did find it really enjoyable.
When did he get time to write this? Because he's so busy.
I don't know. And I think when you read it, it is a very how would I put it? You can tell he was using his notes a lot. It is, I would say, that sort of, it's a light touch. I wouldn't say you get a lot of maybe his personal opinions on Trump and on the sort of the era that it was. Like, it's quite, I guess, careful, as all journalists kind of have to be when they're talking about this kind of stuff. So it does feel a bit like reading his reports. I enjoyed sort of revisiting those times, but I could see why someone else reading it might be like, I watch the news religiously. I can remember almost these lines through it.
We have to remember as well how big America is. Like, he is literally flying over to all these different states. I know he's based in Washington, but he, as you said, has to be everywhere because he has to follow the stories.
Yeah, and it's very much like on the ground, like particularly the depictions of the Capitol riots where like, you have to remember, like his job was to walk in among these crowds at a time when avoiding crowds was national medical advice. And there's quite like scary stuff of like a moment where a Proud Boy rioter was like, "That's a reporter, get him." And luckily, everyone just kind of didn't, that people just kind of like walked off. But like they're like having someone try and incite violence against you on the street is quite stressful. It was stressful for me to read.
I think as well, us being over here, as you said, we were watching all the reports, and I guess we didn't really get a full sense of what it was like. And as you said, he was in the middle of all of that. And over there, I guess it is quite worrying, as you said, knowing that people could just attack you on the street.
It is. I mean, obviously, America at that point was at boiling point essentially, and there was a sense of danger and a sense of kind of calamity, kind of all the time. And that it is really interesting to see his on the ground take with that. There's also stuff I think that wouldn't have maybe made it into the RT reports. He talks a little bit about how Leo Varadkar felt about Trump. Obviously, again, quite careful, but you get some stuff that maybe wouldn't make news, just like personal comments and things like that. And you also get what I found as kind of, I think maybe we all did, as a sort of a hopeful ending towards the book, the advent of the Biden presidency, and little kind of like cute anecdotes of the fact that if you wanted to get Biden's attention during a press conference, you just shouted Ireland and he'd pay more attention because he obviously is a bit of a graw for Ireland. And suddenly all the American reporters started doing that as well. So it is... It is interesting. There's a lot of stuff maybe that wouldn't have made it into the reports, and I did find it fascinating.
Great insight, I guess, into American politics and journalism in America as well. But could you, Dave, possibly give us your best Brian O'Donovan impression?
Oh God. Okay, I've got too much hair. Brian O'Donovan, head tilt, RTE News. I'm sorry, Brian. I love you.
Oh, brilliant. So there you have it, 4 years in the Cauldron, another book for your reading list. And it's not the only book worth your attention, as I found out. And that's it from me and from them. Thank you to Dave, Nadine and Mickey. And most of all, thank you for watching. We'll be back next month with the Christmas special. We'll see you then.